A home. It's something we all need. But for too many, having a safe place to make a home is out of reach. The challenges can seem insurmountable. And yet, each and every day, people are coming together to provide safe, quality, and affordable housing for those in need. Welcome to Let's Talk Housing. I'm your host, Sara Goldvine. Join us as we listen to and learn from people in British Columbia who are creating strong, inclusive communities where everyone can thrive.
Welcome to a special joint episode with On the Way Home podcast and Let's Talk Housing. And we're coming to you today from the National Conference on Ending Homelessness in Halifax, Nova Scotia. Before we get underway, I want to acknowledge the lands that we're gathered on today. This recording is taking place on the unceded and traditional territories of the Mi'kmaq and the ancestral and traditional lands of the Mi'kmaq people. People have traveled here from the territories of thousands of nations across Canada to have the conversations today. And in full transparency, we're recording this on site at the annual Canadian Alliance to End Homelessness Conference, and it's November 9th, 2023. I'm Sara Goldvine from BC Housing, and just really pleased to be joined here by Michael Braithwaite from Blue Door. So maybe, Michael, I can kick it to you. You can just start by talking a little bit about Blue Door and On the Way Home podcast and what brings you to this work.
Absolutely. Thank you, Sara. And welcome, housers, as we call them. So have the good fortune of being part of the team at Blue Door. Blue Door's organization in the north of the GTA that serves our most vulnerable. We help them with, of course, all types of different housing that they require, connection to health care services, and connection to meaningful and well-paying employment that stops the cycle of poverty. And we've been doing that for 41 years. Not all of it, but we've been doing some sort of work with vulnerable people for a long time. We do that north of Toronto in the areas of York, Durham, and Peel. And about 4 years ago now, it was 4 years ago, we started a podcast, first named Out of the Blue for Blue Door, and then partnered with the Canadian Alliance to End Homelessness, almost 3 years now, I think, to change it to On the Way Home and increase the reach to their membership as well. It's been wonderful.
Yeah, so lots of people have been starting podcasts, but you've stuck with it I've lost track of the number of episodes that you've put out. Why do you continue to see value in the podcast? Like, why do you do this?
Well, I'll tell you this. So when it started, a friend of mine had a podcast studio. He said, "Why don't you do a podcast around housing and homelessness?" No one's doing it. And embarrassing enough that I'm like, I don't really know what a podcast is. So I asked my kids, and they're now adults, and they said, "Yeah, like Dad, no one listens to the radio anymore, right? Like if you want, it's about choice, right? And the beauty of podcasts is I could put one on, listen to it whenever I want, in the area of interest that I have, and then come back to it if I can't finish it." And I thought, what a great idea. And the beauty of the podcast, what I love, is there's so much good work going on around the world in this section, and it can be you get easily sometimes deflated because of all the challenges ahead of us. But the podcast is a way of sharing some of the wonderful stories and ideas from around the world of people who have risen up to the challenge and could push through. And I love it. Like every week I learn, whether it's from lived experts or young people who are now taking a huge leadership role, which are like the future, who are really going to make big change happen. Or people on healthcare, or people who are saying food banks are, more food's not the answer. And then we look at research and share that. Because most of it's transferable, what's happening in Finland or Norway or the US or Australia, we could take a lot of knowledge there and transfer it to Canada. And so it's been wonderful. I always thought like we're going to run out of people to talk to, but we never do, because there's so many wonderful and brilliant people doing fantastic work. So it's week after week. I just get to talk to really smart and passionate people. So we stuck with it. And I think with podcasts, part of, keeping your audience is you have to be consistent, and hopefully consistently good too with your guests, right?
Yeah, I love what you've what you said there, because I mean, for me, we know we're in a housing and homelessness crisis, and we see that every day, and it can feel like an insurmountable challenge sometimes, right? Particularly if you've been doing this work for some time, and it's like, okay, here we go again, right? And so I love being able to find those stories of success. I think sometimes we can get overwhelmed as a sector by this, just the significance of the crisis. And then we fail to see and really spend time celebrating the great work that's underway and then the stories of success. I think it's also really important to be like frank and honest about the challenges that do exist. How do you balance that on your, in terms of finding guests between like celebrating the success and then like not sugarcoating the challenge?
It's a good question, right? Because I always like to get people on. I do tell them, and they have a lot of say in crafting the questions. What do you want to talk about? And let me hit those key points. It's not a gotcha podcast. It's not you want to hold people accountable and you want to admit that we still have a lot of challenges ahead and we're not there yet. Our first guest on the Way Home podcast a few years ago was Mayor Iverson, when he was Mayor Iverson out of Edmonton, and it was great. And, you want to push them, but not break them or, and because you'll never get them back, right? And word spreads quick. So we're not that. It really is about, tell us about your challenges. Tell us about, it's okay to share, the failures you've learned about. But more importantly, let's talk about the great things happening. Let's talk about your hopes for the future, what has to happen next. And we talked to people, we had Steve Pomeroy on, Carolyn Wisman. Like, these are people that have been doing this work. Like Steve was talking about in the 80s when, interest rates were 22% and we went through a housing crisis. And so he's been through this before. I mean, just brilliant and years of experience. So it's so wonderful to have that wealth of experience. And now, you want to build up that library. So people are like, okay, if I want to look at the homelessness prevention, or if I want to look at what they're doing in Australia around Indigenous homelessness, I could just go to that episode and drill it up and try and build that up as an information source for people who want to do good work.
Yeah. I mean, you have how many episodes now? A few hundred?
Yeah. It would be, I think just over 200, right? And sometimes there's people that are, we call like the 5-timers club, like Saturday Night Live, where they come back a lot because, say, Daily Bread Food Bank does a Who's Hungry report every year. So we have Neil Hetherington on every year to talk about that. And he's always welcome back. And then you have guests that are just so good and they like us, like they kind of nerd out on this. We have a guy who does all his work, legal work in housing, John Fox, and he's great because any kind of legal piece that he can put into a layperson's terms, right, to help people understand, hey, there was this ruling on encampments in Waterloo. What does that mean for everybody else? And that's great, right, for all these communities that are wondering, so what? And now they kind of know, okay, well, this is what's going to happen in the future.
One of the things that I find as well is that we deal with, there's so much misinformation out there and often disinformation in this space, particularly with the broader audience, but it can happen even within the sector itself, including like encampments is such a heated topic, and the reality on the ground is often very different from what's being conveyed in the media, right? I find the podcast space has been a really good place to really help bring the human side of the story together and really help bust some myths that exist out there. But that also means creating a safe space for people to actually enter and have the conversation. How do you do that? Like, how do you create a space where folks can feel like their voice is welcome on contentious topics in particular?
You know what? So I learned I am not a journalist by any means. I work in housing and homelessness, but I've learned from some of the pros. And if you can make it just a conversation where people relax and you get the best. And I learned that from Steve Bacon on TVO. I remember we were on a panel and everyone was nervous. It's television. And he said, and we had a lived expert, a young person who I could tell was ready to pass out. And he said, just you and I having a conversation, forget the cameras are here, forget. So I do try and weave this is serious stuff we're dealing with. It's heavy stuff. So we always try and weave some humor into it. We ask, just you said, we start with a standard question, what does home mean to you? And I think that puts people at ease because there's no right or wrong, right? And then tell me about your personal path into this. I think that's really interesting for people too, because most people in our sector head, like, in grade 2 during career, like where you want to go to. Everyone wanted to be a police officer, fire, whatever it is. No one was, I'm going to go into housing. So we all kind of come from different paths, right? So it's a unique way to get people to relax, have some fun with it, and really get into it and tell stories. And that's when they're at their best, and that's what you want to do.
Yeah, funny. I actually worked at TVO for a stint and picked up some good tips from Steve there too. Yeah, there's something about like starting off the conversation in a good way, right? That was something that I learned from folks in journalism, is that, yeah, how you start it off sets the energy and sets the tone and creates a space for people to engage. And sometimes we can get really distracted with all of this technology. And, even you and I, like when we're setting up for this, and we've done this however many times, it's like there's finicky pieces, and then you get focused on the piece of machinery in front of you rather than the story and the person. Have you done a lot of episodes with folks with lived experience, and how do you create a space for them that feels accessible?
Not enough, I would say. We have done some, but what we want to get into the practice of, we have, is actually paying them for their time. Because other podcasts, guests, if they're coming on, right, it's their work, so they're getting paid to do it. So we do that, and again, I think it's this weird because it's virtual, but it is that before talk, that before you go and record, is putting them at ease. How's it going? Any questions? Are you nervous? What's happening? What's interesting? We had a print journalist on once, and he was so nervous, and I thought, but you do this for a living. But he said, but I'm used to being the one asking the questions. So he wasn't so comfortable on the other side. And I think they have a lot of stories to tell, and they have, but also is a lived expert, Lee Bursey, who is one of my favorite guests, because he's just he's a former politician, an advocate, a frontline worker, a musician. He's just so, and he experienced homelessness and, had some mental health and other challenges himself and his family. Really, you make that safe. You also, I found out the hard way a little when you do put those out, you need to make sure you're doing the trigger alerts and things like that, trigger warnings, because people watching it, you want to make sure they know ahead of time you're going to talk about some serious stuff.
Yeah, absolutely. So we're on site at this conference, right? And that's where we had this idea. Hey, what if we go in a room together and record it together? But there's like 1,700 people here. It's a huge conference, but like a few years ago, it was only a few hundred. But now it's like it's a pretty massive. It's a massive conference. It's like these folks that people that are coming together around addressing homelessness and have kind of taken over the downtown core of Halifax. What do you think that says about the state of the sector right now?
Well, I think and Tim Richter said it in his opening statement, saying, these are very dark times where there's a lot of negative things happening, and it can get very discouraging. But he said the people in this room are the light on the way forward, and he's right. I think, number one, it says we've got a dedicated, passionate, talented group of people across this country, and this is only a small fraction of that are moving this work forward, and there's great hope for the future. It shows that we don't have all the answers as individuals, but as a group, sharing and getting together and learning from one another, it makes us stronger. And I think the collaboration aspect is what you're seeing here. There's a lot of great work happening in BC, right? And how do we hold that knowledge and spread that across the country? And that's, I think, what this is. And people are acknowledging that we have a huge challenge ahead of us, and the solutions are only going to be found if we work better together. And I think that's why you see, 1,800. That number keeps getting, by 100 or so, but there's a lot of people.
There's a lot of people. It felt like a lot when the fire alarm went off yesterday, and we were all trying to get out the stairwells together. For our listeners, everything was fine. No one got hurt. It was very small incident in the kitchen. I think that one of the things I love about these spaces is when we're doing this work every day, it can feel like often it's just like crisis after crisis after situation in front of you. And it can be really hard to kind of like take a breath and pop your head up and look around. And there is really good work, right? But we can only learn about it when we take a breath, or we create space for our team members and our employees and advocates to also connect with each other too. And getting that balance right between that reaction and just like solving what's in front of you, and actually then stepping back and trying to connect with others and find new ways of approaching our work in a trauma-informed way. It takes like deliberate energy and time to be able to focus on that. And I'm really taking that away from today, from the conference here. One of the things that I've had a couple of conversations with folks, even just today so far, has just been around like this place, right? You mentioned it. It can feel like we're in this really dark time. But any big system change goes through that period, right? Goes through a period of like intense challenge. And there's moments when I'm concerned. It's like, okay, we're in this moment of intensity and challenge and crisis. And maybe that's because we're going towards something better, right? We're building something better. Or maybe it's because it's all coming apart. And I choose to believe that we're going towards something better because it's the only way I can bring my energy to this work every day. But I'd love to get your thoughts on that. Like, do you feel that? Like, I mean, as someone who's worked in the sector for some time, but do you feel like it's more intense now?
Yeah, I mean, so 13 years. So in 2010, if you went and talked to politicians about housing, it was not really an election issue. So a lot of strong good people before me and others, CEH and others, really hammered it into government. They could usually only hold kind of one or two ideas at a time, right? So housing first. They all could tell you, and which is like a huge win, what it is, what it does, like, and then we invest a bit. But I think it's so on the minds of all Canadians right now. And you're right. Like, let's have hope that it's the number one election issue. So people have to pay attention if they want to get reelected. And so they're paying attention to the experts. And there's a government relations seminar earlier, and you say, like, you're the experts, right? When you go in as a politician, you may have no background in housing and homelessness. But so they're looking to the people, the 1,700 people and beyond, to say, listen, I don't have the solutions. You have to tell me the solutions in a way I can digest. Let's take the pandemic as an example of what can be done, right? So pandemic hits, the message from government is stay safe, stay home. We've got 250,000 Canadians approximately that are like, I don't have that. Like, I don't have that place to go. So how do I stay safe? Government threw a ton of resources and said, house people. Our sector within months put thousands of people into housing. So it showed with political will and the dollars how quick we can mobilize. So this is a very solvable issue. I think we've got a lot of things on the table, and I think you're right. It's a turning point where if we could get those resources, I think we're getting the government will, big things can happen. And I get actually pumped up by the younger people. I'm over 50 now, and so my window of time to be part of the solution is slowly coming to an end. But I see young, brilliant leaders here who are challenging that, have the education and the passion and the advocacy. They are not going to let this happen. And it's so cool to see. I think
now we've seen what it looks like when people don't care about housing, right? And like, so my day job is I do communications, public affairs. So I hear from people that I'm like, oh my goodness, there's so much pressure. So much public pressure. And I think that's like this amazing opportunity, because that's like the public is holding governments to account of all political stripes, right? So it's not even necessarily a partisan issue right now. The specific path there's differences of agreement on like what the specific solution should be. But there is resounding consensus in most jurisdictions, certainly in British Columbia, about the need to invest in the housing system. And that's because the public is putting that pressure on their elected officials. I mean, this is how democracy works when it's working well, right? And I've seen what it looks like when the public doesn't care, right? It means there's not the pressure, and then there's not the action or the investment.
Your reelection doesn't depend on it. So the power of, and I'm guessing, I don't know why when you talk about doing a podcast, why you would do, but part of we talked about storytelling and communications.
Yeah.
So I believe that the majority of Canadians care deeply about supporting our most vulnerable. They just don't understand how deep the problem goes. So I always tell this story that I had to talk to 7-year-olds once about homelessness, and and so I asked them what it looks like. And so 7-year-olds don't have filters, right? Like, so they'll say something that would get the rest of people in trouble, right? So when I asked them to describe homelessness, we're like, an old guy with a beard, and they basically describe me, right? But they're talking about what they see on the streets of Toronto, or downtown, and like street homelessness, which is absolutely, or what you see in the east side of Vancouver, like that absolutely is homelessness, but it's so much more. Where when people say, what does homelessness look like? You're like, look in the mirror. There really is no look to it. It's a feeling of loneliness, desperation, sadness, hopelessness, that kind of thing. And it can look like anyone. And I think once Canadians start to understand that, I heard a quote the other day in a movie I was watching, Blackberry, where he said, good enough is the enemy of humanity. And I thought, we live on this good enough for the longest time, people would give someone, with great intentions, here's a granola bar and a bottle of water and like job done. Or we run these seasonal programs, and they list on part of that where we save their life for one night, and like, great job. But that's not housing. And then you ask yourself, would that, if that was your mother, if that was your brother or your child, would that be good enough? And like, of course not. I'd want them to be in a safe, affordable place, and it'd be warm and well fed, like permanently, right? So that's what we should aim for, right. Get past good enough, because it is the enemy of humanity. But I do think, and I've seen it happen, where people, the light goes on and they see it, and then they're pushed to take action, right? Like it's around what is affordable, and that big question, affordable to who?
Yeah, no, I mean, we throw that word around in the sector, like affordable housing. And I can tell you this, the public does not know the definition that we use within the sector, right? Because it's what's affordable to you, what's affordable to me is not necessarily affordable to our neighbors, right? So it's a loaded word. The other word that's loaded is even the word home, right? Like what is a home? And I love that you touched on it there, just the importance of it, going beyond good enough, because ultimately a home for most people is, and I mean, you asked this question on your podcast, right? It's so much more than four walls and a roof. It's community. It's feeling like you belong. It's having a place to make your own. It's autonomy. It's agency. It's connection. It's belonging. It's so many things to so many different types of people. So I want to turn the tables on you. What does home mean to you?
It's good, because I often, when I'm asking people, I'm like, oh, what do I say?
Right?
I'm glad I'm asking the question. But it's where everything starts and everything ends, right? Like, so you start your day there, you end your day. If you don't have a starting position, an ending position, you're lost. And I think that's and you're so right. No one's ever talked about the physical structure of home. When they talk about that, Indigenous friends will talk about the connection to the land, right? And that, and the relationship to nature, etc. But no one talks about that. And it is, the themes that I always think of are safety, and safety where you could just be yourself. We'll say, like, when you close that door, you might present to the world a little differently, but then you could just totally relax, right? And if you don't have that, you never do. For anyone who's ever spent a night on the street, and they talk about like how unsafe in the fear, especially youth, right? We talk about that youth will walk, because there's a stigma to it too. Many youth won't go into a shelter because they're like, oh, I'm not homeless. Like, I don't have a place to stay. So they walk around all night, they sleep in school, and they get labeled lazy, right? And they're not lazy. They finally feel safe enough to take a nap, and they're so beat, right? And what that does to your mental health, and all those pieces. But I listen, I claim that I've learned a lot from failure and from doing things the wrong way. You mentioned community. I think one of the things that we found out too is that for the longest time, we would get people in housing. So we'd work, and we'd be like, all right. So, Bob came in to Porter Place, a men's emergency housing program. He had 29 buddies, and he stayed there for a month. And the staff, he had family staff, and we're like, hey, Bob, did you eat? Did you take care? What are you doing with your housing? Bob, did you go see the doctor? Did you do this? So we put Bob in housing on his own. No one cares about his health. No one's asking if he ate. He has no connections anymore. So 2 months later, Bob's back in emergency housing. Why? Because we didn't create, it's about community. So now you learn, hopefully, from everything we do wrong. You have aftercare workers that really work with Bob to connect to the community and get involved. And are you eating? Are you doing that? Right? So aftercare, because it's so much more, just even from an economic sense, harder to rehouse someone than to keep them housed, right? And that's why you do things like eviction prevention and diversion, whatever. If we can keep people housed, those solutions are a lot easier than finding new housing for individuals. But it is about that connection to community. And quite often, when we were talking with someone from Newfoundland today, where these little small towns, and they all come to Newfoundland because there's nothing there, but you now disconnected them from all they've ever known in that community, and that's not good either.
So where to from here with the podcast? Where do you see it going?
Well, there's certain guests that we would love to have on. I'd love to push hard. We're looking to have the housing minister join, prime minister come on and kind of hear about, hey, what his biggest frustrations are and what he's really hoping to do about it. Listen, I think every week I learned something. A couple of weeks ago, and I think it was actually someone from BC talking about repurposing demolished buildings or buildings where they're saying thousands of buildings get demolished each year of housing, where they can actually be just relocated, or even where you could take those demolished buildings and reuse the materials, and 30% of what's in a landfill are construction material. Like, so all these things that I never even would think of. Why would you reuse materials? And those materials are actually better. Old wood is better in construction than brand new timber, young timber. Who knew, right? Like, it's just innovation and cool things happening. You could always be learning. I think the idea is when CAH in 2021, I think, said, would you partner with us? It's not about Blue Door having the microphone or CAH. It's about a wider audience that we can reach. It is pretty sector specific. I'll tell you, Sarah, my kids would never listen to the podcast. Like, they just won't, right? It's not of interest. But our sector does. And I hear people saying, love this one. Like, I really, this was interesting on encampments or on, prevention or all these different things. So we're going to continue with that as an education tool, and try and pull in and listen to our guests of what is it you do want to hear, and what do you need to hear, and how can we continue to be relevant to tell these stories. I'm going to turn it back on you. What about yourself?
What's next for the podcast?
Yeah.
Well, same. I mean, BC Housing, we work in partnership, right? Like, we mostly deliver housing through our network of nonprofit partners. And so for us, it's about creating a platform for smaller organizations to be able to have these types of conversations, because we have, as a provincial agency, we have access to resources that a lot of smaller organizations don't have. So for us, it's about creating that platform, ultimately with the goal of informing the public conversation, like the conversation within the sector, but then also the public conversation. We promote our stuff on social media. A lot of the clips get a fair bit of traction. And ultimately, we just want to have an informed conversation with the public, because I'm with you. I think that most Canadians really want to be part of a community where everyone is housed, where it's a thriving community, where it's a vibrant community, where it's a healthy community. And the immensity of the problem can be really arresting for folks. Like, they're just not sure what to do. So for me, it's about creating a space where we can really shine that light on the work that is being done and say, yeah, but it's a big problem. But look at all the work that's going on. We know that there are solutions that we can come together around. So it's about creating that platform for that conversation. That's what we're hoping to do.
Listen, I think what you're saying is right on. And I think sometimes inspiration too. For a lot of the people that join, I see people doing, we've had street doctors on who've dedicated their life, who could have made, hundreds of thousands of dollars just working in hospitals. But I look at it in Ottawa, forget his name, he's a doctor who's head of surgery, and he quit that to do community hospital work, like to lead that work. Like, you are an amazing human being. I mean, it's inspiring. Or you look at Al Weeb out of Manitoba, who spent 2 years almost dead on the streets, who now is taking that knowledge and helping reshape things. And there's just so many inspiring people. I actually blankets BC and talking to Greg Gold, who, asked someone once, what can I do to be part of the solution? They said, I just need a blanket. And now, 20 years later, hundreds of thousands of blankets have been given to people. That shows them a little warmth from a volunteer. And he's doing that that's not his career. That's a full-time. And there's a lot of people who are like, how are you doing this work? How Mark from Housing Now, he travels all over Canada because his work's virtual, but it's a full-time job that he does without getting paid, and he's making an impact. So those are individuals that I think there's so many inspiring stories that when those dark times come, listening to people, and that's what this conference is too. When you're here, hopefully you come out recharged and ready to go back and do more work and say, I'm inspired. I talk to these people. Yes, the content of it is great, right? They've got amazing speakers, different people from BC Housing here doing incredible work. But also it's the connections you make outside of those sessions, the networking and talking and introductions and meeting fantastic people from across the country, around the world, and learning from them, the dinners after and that kind of thing that leave you recharged and ready, this sector ready to kind of continue to push forward.
Yeah, I'm feeling charged up. I hope you are. I hope folks are too after listening to this episode. This has been a really fun conversation. So great to meet you. Let's talk again soon.
To learn more about BC Housing, including how to apply for subsidized housing in British Columbia, visit bchousing.org. You can also find us on Facebook, Instagram, LinkedIn, and X. If you enjoyed this episode, give us a rating. This will help others find Let's Talk Housing and join the conversation. You can subscribe to Let's Talk Housing on Apple, Spotify, or wherever you listen to your podcasts.